in this talk, what we're going to talk about is lead user innovations. And it's a very popular term. There have been about 10,000 articles at this point written on it since we developed the term in the 80s. So it's something that people talk about, and they have various interpretations, but you know, it's important that you know about it. So here's how it connects. We're just taking different pieces of these two paradigms and how they connect. And the red circle shows here what today and also next week will be about. Remember, we talked about the fact that in the free innovation paradigm, the consumers develop things, they're self-rewarded, and they diffuse free peer-to-peer. And then last Monday, we talked about the fact that, you know what, they don't have a very high incentive to diffuse. So what we're talking about now, and you see it in that red circle, is mechanisms by which producers pull down user innovations. They, in other words, even if the user is not very active in promoting his or her innovation, the firms themselves begin to realize that this is an important area. And so the firms themselves begin to pull these kinds of things down. And this is what I'm talking with about when Georgia and I talk. Georgia, you're nodding, so far so good. And Georgia is working on trying to understand user innovations in the area of drip irrigation. And the idea is that the firm that makes this equipment is very interested. That's why they're trying to pull this information out of the field. And so today, we'll be talking about that method of identifying lead users and pulling them or their information out from sort of the mass of users in the field. Now, Erdene next week will be talking about sort of a complement to that process. It's a process when the users themselves, the innovators, decide that they want to start a company based on promoting their idea. And then all of a sudden, they too have an incentive because they've become a producer. So that's sort of how to situate the topic for today and next week in this overall sort of topic that we're talking about. Now, what is the definition of a lead user? First of all, lead users can be consumer innovators, or they can be producers who are developing something they intend to use for themselves in their commercial operations. So, harking back to that example of the household user that we used in earlier classrooms, the person who developed an electric powered suitcase, we see that that is a consumer and he's doing it for his own consumption at home. What we see on the right-hand side is something that came up when Mount St. Helens blew up. Basically, Mount St. Helens blew up. There was sort of very sharp kind of volcanic dust all over the streets, and it was getting sucked into the air cleaners of cars and stopping the cars. It would just block them right up. So what you see over there, they're not home consumers. What they are policemen. And what they've done is they've created in the back of the car a giant sort of bag filter. And then they run that tube, which they got from sort of Home Depot that connects home dryers to the wall. And they run that into the air cleaner of the car so that they can continue to function. So they're doing that because they have a commercial function. But in both cases, they have user insights and they're developing these things as users. So for the purposes here of what we're doing, today and the method we're talking about, you can either think about that as something that if you're in a firm that does consumer products that you could use with respect to consumer innovations, or it's something that you could use with respect to industrial innovations, if that's the story that you're involved in. Now, what is a lead user then? Oh, I forgot the definition up here, sorry. So lead users, way back in 1986, we defined them as they have needs that are ahead of general demand in the marketplace. Others will have it over time, but they have it now. And number two, second part of this definition of lead users, they expect to obtain high benefit from a solution to their needs, and so they may innovate, right? Now, the image of that car there, that's not necessarily a lead user innovation because it doesn't foreshadow general demand. Mount St. Helens does not blow up every day. But it's still a user innovation because they have high benefit from a solution. But a firm would not look into that particular innovation and say, wow, I want to commercialize that, because the demand is just fleeting, right? So what we're talking about is marketplace demand. And what we see here is this curve. Basically, you have the life cycle curve of a product, and you can imagine all those little circles as customers. And we have sort of the very early edge of need occurring when lead users who are ahead of demand start experiencing a need. So for example, in the area of, let's say, video editing, what you see first in the leading edge is firms have a really important, like Pixar, people who make movies and so on, have a very strong need, and they're really pushing the leading edge because they can afford leading edge equipment, they can afford software developers, and it's important for their product that they have really cool special effects. Later, what you find is that manufacturers say, oh, you know what, we can make that for you. And they start to incorporate these user-developed editing tools into a toolkit that then more ordinary users can use. And then eventually you get into consumer products where some of these things are actually embedded into smartphones or something like that, okay? So the interesting thing is that manufacturers don't find this early edge appealing because it's a small and uncertain market. You don't know if other people are going to want it. And the problem is that if you're a manufacturer, you have to sell to a lot of people to justify actually gearing up to produce and sell a product. So what has happened in the world, but it's sort of invisible to standard marketing research and to the producer innovation paradigm, what has happened is the leading edges are occupied by user innovators, the kind of people we've seen so far in this course. And the manufacturers think they are the innovators doing market research, but really what they're doing is picking up on prototypes and improving them, as we saw in earlier talks. Now, so what you then may notice, once again, I'm showing you, by the time you finish this course, you will be so loaded up with this. I mean, you will see this 2 arrows in your sleep. But one of the things I want to point out to you now is you'll notice that the top arrow, the consumer innovation, free innovation paradigm arrow, starts before the producer innovation paradigm. And that's because, again, the activities that users need to engage in are justified by self-reward. They only have to know if they want something. Producers, in contrast, have to wait for that to evolve, that information, to see whether there's a general market before they enter. So that's why 10 or 20 years typically is how the user innovators precede the producers. So kids, for example, with skateboards, you know, they were doing skateboards, and companies said, well, so what, if they even knew? And then hundreds of kids were using and making their own skateboards. And then thousands of kids were using and making their own skateboards. And at that point, manufacturers said, oh, before each user could justify making something he or she enjoyed, now we see that there's a market there as well, and so we will enter. Anyway, that's why the top arrow is somewhat to the left of the bottom arrow. We can see this kind of a thing very sharply in the studies that have been done of the history of innovation in given fields. So for example, this is whitewater kayaking there that you see on the right-hand side. And you're probably all familiar with those kayaks. You've seen them in videos and so on. But it was started by people who were kayakers who were used to travel kayaking, it was called. You had long kayaks and you'd sort of go up and down rivers and so on. And white water was something to avoid, because when you got into white water or down a waterfall or something, these long, thin kayaks would break in half, and that was considered awkward by the user. So what happened was some hackers said, you know what, it might be actually fun to get into the white water instead of avoiding it. And so they began pushing them into waterfalls and so on, and the things would break. And they would say, okay, what we have to make is shorter kayaks, for example, so that the forces are distributed sort of locally. They're not spread over a long kayak. And that way we'll be able to get down the waterfall more effectively, and so on and so forth. They did all this stuff. They developed these kinds of special hulls. They developed the straps to keep you in. They developed the helmets. They developed everything about this sport. And that was, as you can see on the chart on the left here, phase one. That was when there were maybe a couple of thousand people building their own kayaks, sharing their own information, and doing increasingly radical things. So I don't know if you know, but people have gone down really high waterfalls relatively recently. And they do something they call boomfing. All of this is totally insane as far as I'm concerned. But anyway, boomfing is that you go off a 90-foot waterfall and you aim at rocks that are on the way down, and you boomf off those rocks to slow yourself down. And it's the sound of the kayak hitting the rocks that's called boomfing, because it's a boomf sound. Anyway, they're developing also the methods, as you can see. They're developing methods to flip and work in white water and so on. Now the dark lines there are the number of important innovations over time that the kayakers themselves developed. And the kayakers themselves, as you can see here, utterly dominated, right? There was, over the 50-year history of the sport, and don't ask me to ever do a study like that again with my colleagues, we nearly all died going through all these literature on the field and all the rest of it. We nearly died, oh my God. But anyway, these important innovations were maybe about 100 and something over the 50 years, and you can see that they're entirely initially done by the users. And the producers only enter later. They're the light gray. And interestingly enough, and I'll get to it in a minute, in the latest phase, it's pretty much all manufacturer innovation, and I can explain why. Okay, so this is a typical pattern. And you see it in other fields. So this is a field of scientific instruments. Notice here, this is a curve now, and the dotted line is manufacturer innovations. The number of innovations is on the left per year, I think. And on the bottom is years. Now, the dark line is user innovations. And what you see there is these are devices that are used in science to measure surface chemistry, to measure what the materials are on the surface of an object, the chemicals that make it up. And you see there from 1953 to about 1970, it was only user innovators. And then the manufacturers came in and they picked up strongly. And then you sort of see again, both sides declining. Now, what's going on there? What's going on there is that the users here are scientists, and the users want a new device. They need it to measure what they want to measure. It's a pretty sophisticated device. It sort of looks like an electron microscope in the sense that it's a vacuum column, and what you're doing is shooting down electrons, and you're causing secondary electrons to come flying off the sample, and then you pick it up with a sensor and so on. So it was sophisticated, and the scientists who did it were pretty sophisticated folks. And they built this equipment in their own labs. Now, the manufacturer again was, well, yeah, maybe somebody will want that. Maybe a lot of people want that. I don't know. The manufacturer was sitting around to see whether that instrument had a comparative advantage. So notice the manufacturer, again, is not jumping in there and developing this thing from scratch. The manufacturer is sitting there waiting for the market to evolve before it makes a decision to innovate. Now, what happens is that you see on the bottom there, the commercial market. And the commercial market is lined up with about 1970 when the manufacturers got into the market and started to innovate. Now, what you then see is the manufacturer innovations taking off, and the user innovations are declining. Now, why is that? That's because basically the users are mining out the possibilities in this area with respect to function that's important to them. What the manufacturers are then jumping in there and doing is the manufacturers are jumping in and saying, oh, okay, now we can make it more convenient for you because you haven't done that. You didn't care enough to do that on these home-built prototypes that you made for yourself. So we can do that. And so there's room in that space for all sorts of things like automation, even while the fundamental innovations are declining. And then those things decline too, even though the scale of the market is going up, because also it's about as convenient as it can be and so on and so forth, right? So this is the general pattern. It is absolutely the case that even though manufacturers sit around and say, we are finding a need and filling it, with respect to novel function, what really is going on is that the users are doing it. Now,
Eric, I'm just going to jump in there. Seema has a question that's related to that last slide.
Okay, go ahead.
The question, Professor, is does the amount of investment from the manufacturer, does that also play a role here? So if there's a product that requires very heavy investment from the manufacturer to commercialize it, the risk is going to be relatively high, hence the diffusion is going to be slow, versus if the low investment, the risk is low. I'm curious if your research shows any data around that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The manufacturer has to invest a lot more to make a manufacturable, field supportable product that they distribute nationwide and worldwide than a user does to make a prototype just for their own laboratory. So yeah, they really have to wait around, if that's your point, to make sure there is a market that can support this. Is that what you're thinking?
To some degree, yes. My thought was, let's take one case where they don't know the market, but the investment needed to commercialize is very little, compared to another case where they don't know the market, but the investment needed is much higher.
Ah, I see.
The time
Yeah.
to market that will change, right? In that case.
Yeah. It's always yes, but it's also relative investment, right? So it's if the user and the manufacturer both have very little investment to make, the user presumably still has less, right, than the manufacturer, because they have to do things that the user doesn't do, like, you know, distribute this thing, advertise it, and so on. Is
Yeah,
that, yeah.
that's right.
But your point is absolutely well taken. Yeah, they make a decision based upon their own sort of private returns versus their investments, and this can
That's
vary.
right.
Yep, absolutely right. Yeah, thank you. All right, so now this raises a question, and it's kind of interesting. How do we find these lead user innovations, right? Interestingly enough, traditional market research is focused on the middle of the market. I don't know if any of you have taken a marketing research course, but it's focused on the middle of the market. It's focused on what does the average user need that we can supply to most people. Now, interestingly enough, the kinds of market research methods that they use, surveys and so on, tend to throw out people as atypical, who are the ones that we want to focus on for our lead user studies. We want to get the people at the leading edge that are regarded by the producers as not their market. They're off doing stuff for themselves, you know, they're not going to be satisfied with what we do for them. And no, what we want is the general purpose laboratory in the middle. So systematically, in other words, the standard find and need it and fill it marketing research methodology is inappropriate for finding lead users. So somehow, what we need to do is find those people on the leading edge. That's the goal. So whereas this kind of a thing, it's easy to find the users, they're right in the middle of your market, and the sophistication in marketing research is sort of analyzing their needs, and that's the focus of the marketing research field. Oh, well, you do a survey, and then you analyze their needs 9 ways from Sunday to find out what a profitable product might be with respect to improvements. And over here, the real issue is search. How do you find those people? So the method that Mary and I developed along with someone named Joan Churchill, Mary Sonic, who early adopters, or Mary, can you wave? Are you there somewhere? Where are you?
Right
There
here.
you. Did she show up, Jade?
She sure did. Yeah,
Okay.
looking very lovely.
There you go.
Yeah.
So
And
what
Eric,
happened?
before, I'm sorry, I don't want to kill
Sorry.
your flow here. I just, before you transition to talking about how to solve it, I think Aditi has a question still related to this concept of lead users.
Sure.
So Aditi, if you'd like.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Hey, Professor. Actually, my question was from one of the slides, maybe 3 or 4 before this.
Uh-huh.
We talked about we don't want to, so like lead users come up with that use case, they want to solve this problem, and then, you know, then later on it kind of percolates to the general market.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't really understand, like, why are certain people the first ones? So some people, so why only a few people would be the first ones to have a problem? And then how would other people start having that problem later on? Is it because this person is talking about it, doing some publicity, or they're sharing with their friends, and then other people are like, oh, I didn't realize even actually I have that problem. I never thought about it.
Well, it's interesting and a very, very good point. In some cases, it's sort of like the technology to implement something is very expensive. Like in the example I told you about editing, I guess in principle, lots of people would like to have that, but the only people who can afford it are the people at the leading edge. In other cases, it's not obvious that everybody will want something. like the skateboard. It's not obvious. People are inventing sort of games and toys and all sorts of things all the time, and only some of them pick up. And so what you find is that has to be a filtering process somehow from the manufacturer's perspective as to whether the innovation that a given user wants does serve a marketplace demand, right? And so if we look at this particular slide, and then I'll come back to you and you tell me if I've answered you or not, okay? So if we look at this particular slide here, what the method did was it says, let's start with an important marketplace trend. Let's start something so that we're not picking up something that's just special for somebody. Let's start with something where we know the market is going to need something in that direction. For example, in the 3M case with Mary, and we'll see also a tape on that in a little bit, suppliers of medical devices to reduce surgical infections knew that antibiotics were failing, right? And so they knew that the general market surgeon would want improvements to infection control. But still, at the time of the project, only 2 or 3% of people in the general surgical population ended up with infections, and they could be handled generally by antibiotics, right? So the ordinary surgeon wasn't there yet. It wasn't a big enough problem. And so what you'll see in the course of this story is that what we did was we said, there is a general marketplace trend here, namely infection control independent of antibiotics. Let's go out and see and find the surgeons who have that problem now in extreme form because of the kind of patients they're treating. And so we went out, among others, to the surgical oncologists, the cancer people, because their patients were immune compromised due to chemotherapy and the rest. And so they had 30% infection rates. And they had to do something now. Does that help?
Yeah. And, you know, I mean,
when you say, yeah, I know it's sort of only half. Go ahead.
No, actually it makes sense. And I'm trying to relate to it because, you know, at Sloan, we do so many class projects, you know, come up with an innovation and a marketing class or any other class. And then everybody does surveys, right, on Qualtrics. And they want to survey their classmates and their families and friends and sharing it on WhatsApp and social media. So I'm thinking about how effective is that, because then isn't that, then you're kind of surveying the general population. You're not really surveying the, you know, the lead users.
Exactly right. You're not.
So,
and you know, the likelihood of having a lead user in any random sample isn't enormous, right? So yeah, that's why you have to specially go out and search for them.
right. So maybe it's not effective to just survey just randomly, just on social media.
No, again, it depends upon what you're trying to do, right? If you are trying to find leading innovations, no. By definition, those are few people who are at the leading edge, right?
Okay, thank you.
But for general purposes, like, well, we've developed it already, how would you like it? Maybe you can, you know, use that. So you have to figure out what your purpose is. So now, what we have here, and I should introduce again Mary. So Mary, so I had these ideas, and I wanted to try them out in companies, and no company wanted to do that. They said, no, that's really, it's magnificently stupid. It's not just stupid, but it's magnificently stupid because it's not what we do. And Mary was nice enough. She was at 3M, and somehow I was introduced to her. And she was nice enough to listen, and she thought that was a great idea. And so she managed to get us some funding to do this at 3M as a project and to develop a methodology. And one of the things you'll see in a little bit is a video. A series of videos was done by Mary and myself and somebody else. And we did all that stuff. And I thought, wow, this is so great. Companies are really appreciating my brilliant insights. So Mary introduced me to a guy named Les Crow, who was the source of our money. He was the head of R&D at 3M. And so I started in with how marvelous it was that he had such deep insight. And he sort of looked at me cross-eyed and he said, I don't know what the hell you're doing. I'm just supporting it because Mary said so, right? So it totally put me in my place as to what people thought of this methodology still. But Mary, yeah, we built it into something important, Mary. 25% of US companies now, so that's pretty good. So congratulations and thanks to you. Yeah. All right, so now we're going down and we're saying somehow or other we have to identify an important market need or trend, and then we have to figure out how to search for lead users. So now let's look at an 11-minute video on the traditional method of carrying out a study to identify lead users. What you'll hear is what we did in '95 when we came up with this methodology. And what you'll see, therefore, is you'll see nothing in the way of, you'll see it's pre-internet. I don't know why this thing's jumping, but I apologize. You'll see pre-internet. It was filmed 25 years ago, and lots of paper, journals, and telephoning being used. And you will also see your teacher, Eric, still had brown hair back then. So don't be shocked, it's not my son, it's me, 25 years ago. All right, so let me now go, again, I don't know why these are jumping, but let me now go to the video, and it's 11 minutes long, and it'll give you the general idea about how we approach these things from 3M's point of view as a firm using it.
In this introductory video, you'll learn what lead user methods can do for your organization. You'll hear how 3M divisions have benefited from lead user studies and see an example of an actual lead user study carried out at 3M.
Can you just slightly move your mouse down a bit so that the little play button disappears?
Evolved from Eric von Hippel's path-breaking research into the sources of innovation. His research showed that a select group of lead users have been the actual inventors of many of the most successful products and services for consumers and industry.
What are lead users? Lead users have two characteristics. First, they have a high incentive to solve a problem, and so they may innovate. After all, as you know, necessity is the mother of invention. Second, they are ahead of the target market in an important dimension, so that what they want in the present is what the market as a whole will want in the future. Let me give you an example of one or two lead user innovations. Take Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web. Tim needed hypertext and networked computers for his own work. That's why he developed it. It was a lead user innovation because the market as a whole, as you all know, then followed, and it became a major cultural phenomenon.
During the course of a study, teams seek out lead users both within the target markets and lead users in analogous fields and other industries as well. Innovation in automotive braking systems illustrates the value of looking for lead users outside as well as within your targeted markets.
Many of the safety features that we take into ordinary account nowadays in automobiles were actually developed in aerospace first. For example, the braking systems were developed there because the aircraft people cared a lot more about stopping an aircraft. It was before the end of the runway. So you could see that the incentive to do the same stopping problem was there in aerospace as well, but in an exaggerated form, and you can bring it into the auto field from this advanced analog market.
The team locates lead users using a telephone networking process. It works a lot like tracking down a hot news story.
Team members typically start out the search by getting a list of expert names through such means as electronic searches, scanning current trade journals, or contacting their industry friends for some expert names. Then they simply begin calling people on the list and asking a question such as, who do you know that is doing leading edge work on the subject of X?
Lead user studies enable 3M divisions to identify leading-edge market opportunities that were not apparent with traditional methods, such as focus groups and large customer surveys.
Studies have resulted in major new product approaches for a number of 3M divisions. For example, in one study just completed, the result was a whole family of concepts for radically new products that will be brought to market soon. In two other recent ones, the goal was opportunity identification. In both these cases, the team uncovered promising entry markets and applications for very important new 3M technologies. Lead user studies have also been used to identify long-range growth strategies. In fact, that was one outcome of the medical product study you'll learn about shortly.
Now let's take a look at a lead user study carried out by 3M's Medical Surgical Division. This division produces surgical drapes and other related asepsis control products for the surgical setting.
Our business unit in the Medical Surgical Division launched a lead user study to identify new approaches for preventing patient infections. The decline in effectiveness of many antibiotics today makes this a very important problem in medicine. For our study, a cross-functional team was assembled of top-notch people from product development, marketing, and manufacturing. All team members had previously made major innovation contributions for our Medical Surgical Business Unit.
In phase 1, management and the research team do the homework to begin the lead user study.
The team and key managers in our business work closely together to define the general types of products and markets of interest and the level of innovation that was desired. The team also did a scan of trade literature and talked with some of our key customers. These activities gave us an overall sense of trends and market issues that would be really important to research during the study.
In phase 2, the lead user study is launched with an in-depth exploration of need-related trends. The goal is to identify a specific set of major needs that present strong new product or service opportunities.
During our trend investigation, we cast our net broadly for experts in varied fields who could point us to cutting-edge market opportunities. For example, we interviewed a leading international expert on the dangers of antibiotic overuse. We also consulted with a renowned expert in sources of skin contamination. Another very informative interview was with a prominent U.S. Army surgeon. He was pioneering a non-invasive technique for actually negating potential sources of skin bacteria.
After about 6 weeks of interviewing and reading, teams go through an intensive process of evaluating and selecting the needs that will be the focus of concept generation in the next phases of the study. In phase 3, the focus of a lead user study shifts to acquiring new product and service ideas. During this phase, teams typically visit the sites of select lead users to observe firsthand their needs and innovative solution ideas.
At this point in our study, our team realized that developing countries could present a major growth opportunity for our business. And we had a lot more to learn about the healthcare needs in these regions. So in pairs, team members fanned out to a number of different countries in Asia and South America. We devoted a month to visiting hospitals and observing surgery. We also interviewed experts in microbiology and infectious diseases. In Malaysia, for example, we learned from lead user practitioners how, with limited resources, they achieved very cost-effective and efficient infection prevention.
At the conclusion of phase 3, teams have a portfolio of promising solution concepts. These concepts are further developed in the 4th and final phase of the study. A lead user workshop is the central activity of phase 4. For the workshop, a small group of lead users and top experts join the team to do intensive design work and problem solving over a 2 to 3 day period.
We brought in a group of 11 lead users and leading experts from diverse fields for our workshop. This is the overall task we gave the attendees. as a workshop, we'll feel we've done it if at least 3 concepts with dynamic elements in them come out of here. Concepts about what? Product concepts that dramatically improve microbial control in the surgical settings of today and possibly tomorrow with significantly improved costs. During the workshop, small groups were formed to work on generating initial product concepts. Then, every 2 to 3 hours, the whole group convened to refine and evaluate the solution ideas that had been generated. The lead user attendees were carefully selected for their leading edge expertise in different aspects of the workshop task.
I have a PhD degree in synthetic organic chemistry, but I didn't do any synthesis. I was involved mostly with application. And one of the things I discovered and found out was one of the materials would make a nice artificial skin.
Dr. Irving Schmolka was the developer of artificial skin and chemicals that enhance interaction with skin.
We saw about 38,000 pets last year, which makes us the 3rd largest hospital in the U.S., possibly in the world. My patients don't bathe. Came back sometimes saying, "Are you close to it?" But I deal with a situation where the hair causes a lot of adhesion problems to the drapes.
Dr. Robert Rook is a leading veterinary surgeon. He has achieved low infection rates under very demanding conditions and even at low cost.
So what I could bring to the group is use of silicones and urethanes and other materials and to cast body parts or adhere to the skin or work with the skin in terms of casting or injections and that sort of thing.
This is Mike Defoe, makeup specialist for Broadway Productions. We wanted his expertise in adhering materials to irregular skin surfaces.
After the lead user workshop, teams do a final refine.
Okay, let's go back. Jane, can you share me out of this one? Or let's see, wait a minute. I'll close that. And then, okay. And then here.
You just hit share screen again.
Yeah, thank you. So here's the idea again, right? The idea is we're trying to find people at the leading edge. And the example here that we talked about in the video was basically reducing surgical infections. So that was the trend. And we move forward on that trend. And, you know, I mentioned before that one of the people that, or the kinds of, what we basically did was we said at each level, who do you know who has a worse problem than you do? So we talked to general surgeons and they'd say, oh God, those oncologists have a much worse problem than we do. And then we'd go and talk to the oncologists. Now, in the course of that, we collected people who had innovations of different types that were needed to address different aspects of the problem. So one of the people you saw in that lead user group that we brought together, all of them had innovated. All of them had reduced surgical infections, but they had different emphases. So the surgical oncologist, no matter what the cost, was trying to reduce infections in people. The veterinary person that you saw there had somehow managed to get low infection rates at low cost. Animals, pets don't have medical insurance. It had to be something at low cost, and so he did. And we found the same thing in the military. It was sort of low cost and so on and so forth. So what you would then do is you would get together these people who each had developed something important that worked, and you'd say, how can we combine what you're doing? How can we take the low-cost aspects of the veterinary solution and put it together with some of the work that the oncologists are doing to come up with something that is both affordable and really effective? So you can see that there was active engagement on the part of the innovation group, it wasn't that we were pulling together random people who would say, let's imagine a solution. It was people who had solved problems as lead users, created prototypes, and were now trying to merge their prototypes to serve the more general market. Now, in a minute, I'm going to ask you to get into groups and think about lead user innovations that you may have known. And I'll explain what that task is in a minute. But before we get there, I'm going to give you another example, which is maybe came off another 3M study that we did, and it was very interesting and maybe more accessible in a sense than the medical one. So people were trying to get lead paint off walls, right? I mean, you know, houses were painted in the US with lead paint. You wanted to remove the paint so that the children would not be at risk, because children would tend to eat it. It's sweet. So basically the method that was developed was insanely dangerous. It was and it's still used today, it was to take an intact layer of paint, which is fairly non-accessible to kids, grind it up into tiny pieces with sandpaper so that any kid can lick it up, inhale it or whatever, and then try to vacuum up the pieces with with high filter vacuum things. So the question is, again, is there a better way? Not that we can imagine as an R&D group, but that people out there have done. And so what we did was we went out to people who had an extreme need for safety. For some reason, they had to work like in areas where people were occupying them at the same time, the rooms. So you couldn't do that thing about sealing it off and cleaning it up. So what did they do? What these people had figured out, and it was the damnedest thing ever, they had figured out that duct tape and other very aggressive adhesives would hold on to paint better than paint would hold on to the wall. So they would rub the wall with this duct tape. They would put duct tape on it, and then they would peel off the duct tape along with the intact layer of paint and pull it off that way without first fragmenting the layer. Now, this had been developed in two areas. One was that, namely safety, and another one was, interestingly enough, people who were trying to preserve historic structures. What you see there on the right is Mount Vernon, which is George Washington's house. Now, if you were going to do the standard thing of every 20 years, sand the house and then paint it again, soon you would sand away the entire house. Each time you're removing part of the structure. So they too came up with this idea of tape to pull off paint from the wall. Now, fascinatingly enough, that was, and Mary may remember this was an exceedingly different and difficult thing to convince 3M had any merit. Even though you'd think, you know, well, you're going to sell a few square feet of sandpaper, or are you going to sell enough duct tape to wrap around a house? Wouldn't it be nicer for you commercially to wrap duct tape around a house? It turned out that the culture within 3M was thou shalt not have tape that pulls paint off the wall. They make masking tape. They have laboratories all over the place that say, can you pull off that tape without removing the paint underneath? And so the cultural resistance to this was enormous. And so this is one of these kinds of problems you get. When you come up with something really radical, the firm doesn't necessarily have enthusiasm for it, which is why we learned that by the process. And this is why the first step of the process in these lead user studies was always to ask people what kinds of innovations they would find acceptable, because you'd find all these cultural reasons why they wouldn't do this, that, or the other thing. And so we had to learn that up front. Okay, so here is the task.
Actually, just before you jump in that class, Ponte has a question for you related to this.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hello. Firstly, congratulations on the work, Professor and Mary. Excellent work.
Thank you. Thank you.
On that note, I just wanted to check whether there's a study or assessment done on this method versus other methods, and how do we verify that this is better. Intuitively, it makes a lot of sense to me, but has there been an objective sort of study to see that this is a better method?
Yeah, very well said. And let me just jump ahead a couple to show you that, because absolutely we have the same issue, namely, we don't want to be promoting a religion. We want to be showing something that has data attached. So and then I'll come back to your assignment. But so again, 25% of US companies are using it these days, supposedly. And what we did was, to answer your question, Ponce, was we said, fine, what we want to do is compare studies using the lead user method, or innovation development projects using the lead user method, with those doing the standard method of market research followed by find a need and fill it. And we made a manual so that everybody would be doing the lead user process the same way. We did this across 3M divisions. And we did a manual so that they were sure that they were all doing the same R&D method the same way. We were really then comparing methods. And here's what we found. I mean, and there weren't a lot of lead user studies. There were only 5 projects. But the effect was so huge that it was statistically significant nonetheless. So basically, the novelty, if you look at these columns there, see lead user ideas, N equals 5 versus non-lead user ideas. That's these 2 groups. And you can see that the novelty was much higher. You know, it is in line with this kind of thing that I've been teaching you about. The manufacturers tend to do dimension of merit improvements, and the users tend to come up with new things. So what you really had there was the novelty of the lead user ideas was such that they started new product lines for the companies, whereas the others were improvements, like, for instance, a pediatric size of a surgical device. What 3M had is a system in-house for deciding whether they were going to invest in a project to commercialize it and scale it, because they were always getting these projects coming in with business cases attached. And so this was a standard method of projecting profitability that was used across the corporation, and the projected profitability was, as you can see, much higher. And interestingly enough, you can see also that we basically have estimated sales in years 5, which was then become actual after you know, this study period was over, were 8 times higher than the valuation of the likely valuation of the sales in the standard method. So yes, to your point, Ponce, since then there have been a number of studies done by others. So this was a study that I made sure the lead authors, and I participated, but that the lead authors and so on were not me. And we're marketing researchers who were not necessarily looking at this with kindness. And so I didn't have a slam dunk audience. But yes, it's been shown now that it works better. And the important thing for you is you can see now why it would, right? You can sort of see that if the innovation process is concentrated with respect to functional novelty, new things, in users, because the need comes up within a few users before the general marketplace is available, it makes sense, all this, right? Do you have any related questions to that further, or is that sort of like what you wanted to know?
No, that's brilliant. Thank you so much.
Exactly the like of what one wants to hear, right? Yes, you're such a fantastic kid. What can I say? Anyway, so let me back up then. And now, in line with this kind of thing that I've asked you to do on the weekly papers, what I want you to try to do is connect this up with your own thinking and your own experience, okay? So what I want you to do is think about, all of you have worked in companies, I think, or almost all of you. And so you know something about particular areas. What you're trying to do here is test it with the knowledge you have. So you would choose an area that you know something about it. If it's in finance, great, you would think in finance. If it's in engineering of a given type of product or software, you'd think about that. And when I mean specific market and specific major trend, I'm not suggesting that you think about something as large as all computers. I'm suggesting you think of something like fault-tolerant computers, some narrow segment where you can sort of actually play around and think, who is the lead user, for example? Who would need a fault-tolerant computer? You know, who would need that most? Because those are typically not the ones that your company, let's say it manufactures fault-tolerant computers, is dealing with. Marketing research is looking at the middle of the market. But who needs it most? And who of those people or firms have a high incentive and the resources to do something about those needs? Those are the people you want to look for within the target market. Now, you also want to brainstorm possible lead users outside the target market, because in what I told you earlier in these examples, what you get is you get surgeons, for example, who are your target market as 3M. They want to sell surgeons with respect to humans. They want to sell them surgical asepsis devices or materials. But as I told you, it's also the case that beyond that, there might be people who have an extreme need beyond the need faced by your customers. They don't have to be in your market at all. And so you go outside and you say, well, who the heck would that be, right? And so an example is that we did a study of automotive braking. And the ABS braking and so on that you saw in the video, the kind of ways to bring your car to a stop on ice and so on. And what we saw there was there were users within that market, namely the standard users of cars. And then there were users at the leading edge of that automotive market. They were people like car racing drivers. And those people, still in the automotive market, spent all their time trying to get right to the edge of skidding so they can get around the corners better. And then outside that market entirely was aerospace, where aircraft were coming down, aircraft were landing on runways that were not treated with salt, they were not treated with sand, because that would wreck the airplanes. And so they had very demanding conditions. They were landing at very high speed relative to cars. They had very demanding conditions, okay? So they're outside, they're an advanced analog in the sense that they have the same problem, but worse than the customers you may have dealt with, okay? So now we're gonna put you into groups for 12 minutes. And each of you should think about this and try to explain to colleagues, you know, where these lead, who might be lead users for the kinds of products I was familiar with. And both inside the market and outside, who has that need? So now let me ask, are there some who would like to volunteer what they came up with and how amazing it was and how wonderful?
Yeah, I saw Julia's hand go up pretty quickly.
Sorry?
I see Julia's hand. There you go.
Yeah, so my example was with the target market college students. So since we're all at home and our grades are on pass no record, we have more time to do leisure activities like playing games. I was thinking about how like popular games get diffused. And I believe that the lead users within the target market are the so-called gamers, as well as people who are just active on Facebook in general. And a specific example I used was Word Blitz, which is a Facebook game. My friend invited me to play once, and since then I've invited a few others to play, and that's how like the Facebook network makes these games popular. And possible lead users outside the target market are like adults who we look up to as like a role model, or just like siblings who have more time to play games than MIT students.
Good idea. Yeah. So, and those would not normally be people that marketing research would be surveying, right? And so that's the point, you know, yes, kids, as you just, I love that last point, you know, kids have much more freedom. And so they probably have figured out much better ways to use spare time, or at least have more inventiveness with respect to that than do MIT students who, as we all know, suffer and slave and so on. And I'm glad to hear that you're now freer. But anyway, that's a very good example. Yes, thank you. Anybody else? Okay. Then let me quickly go on, okay, because I want to now tell you, this is the last part of the time, and I want to quickly tell you that we have now developed more modern methods of doing it. Conceptually, what you saw was lead users and how to find them. And let's see if I'm here. And this is a method which is very difficult to do right, because what you have to do is talk to somebody and you have to say, well, who has a more complicated problem than you? So for example, with respect to collision avoidance in cars, you know, you have to have really sort of creative people involved. You know, it was a question about collision avoidance, and it was a study again at 3M. And the people who were best at this kind of collision avoidance were military munitions makers who were trying to cause collisions or avoid them. You know, it's like, how does my missile avoid or hit your whatever? And the algorithms they were using and so on were sort of way in advance. But to think of that, you know, is not so easy. So it was pretty tough for companies to do in a good way. Now, so what we're trying, there's a guy named Sandro Coulartz and myself, and Sandro works at a company called Ipsos, which is a marketing research company, and which is discovering basically that nobody really wants their standard marketing research methods anymore. They need to come up with something new. And so what Sandro and I have come up with, and it's largely Sandro's brains, is the idea of saying, can we analyze, in the case of consumer products, can we analyze all the user-generated content on the web to try to find user innovations and then determine if they're lead user innovations? So in the earlier method, it was, let's find something which the market is going towards. And then we'll find people who are extreme in that, and those are lead users. This is different. What this is doing is saying, let's find who's doing anything, and let's see if other people are picking up on it. So it's fundamentally a different approach, and we've written a first paper on it, which is, I think, in your readings, and it's getting very cool. People are really starting to grab onto it, and I think it'll be of use to you too. The basic idea is, we did a pilot study. The paper that you'll see was in kite surfing, and we did it because in that field, we knew already that the users were the developers. So if we couldn't find user innovations using these big data tools, there was something wrong with the method. It wasn't wrong with the fact that there was nobody out there. So what we basically did was this. We collected content, that is all sorts of information on the web. We did a sort of a relevance audit, and I'll explain that in a minute. And then we used sort of two kinds of models to analyze those data for key terms. And then we sort of had converted about 1 million kind of posts to a few hundred posts that we could then examine by hand to say, well, what really is there? So that was the sequence. And basically, it was blogs and forums and so on. And we did a content scraping. This was all open information. People were posting it for general use. And what we found was that really the places that people went to talk about kite surfing, for example, in this instance, they were specialized forums. They weren't things like Twitter. They were specialized forums within Reddit. There were specialized forums that were entirely independent, like kiteforum.com. And we ended up with, like, for instance, of the entire kite surfing corpus, that is, of the entire number of millions of posts on the web that mentioned kite surfing, most of them were in these specialized forums. Now, this is really kind of interesting because what it means is that when people are users and they start to collaborate, they start to get into these specialized things to talk to each other. And so it's much easier to go and find these user innovations and be able to evaluate them by this kind of an approach. So basically, only 3.5% of this thing was in things like YouTube and so on. It was really these specialized forums. So then what we started to do was filtering. What we had was a bunch of basically posts that said kind of indicative things like, I had a problem and I solved it, right? So it's not stating just a need. It's a, I had a problem and here's what I did about it. And then within that, you had kind of topic clusters. So they would say those general things like, I innovated, in effect, I problem solved, I figured out, I this, that, the other, a bunch of terms like that. And then you had specific, what did I figure out? So did I figure out something? If you see that blue area on the left, it's different kinds of features of a kite surfing device, which they are talking about. That's hardware, like the harness that holds you to the kite surfing kite, or something called a chicken loop, which you can use to detach yourself from the kite, and so on and so forth. So then we're narrowing in, right? Just imagine you can look at those millions of things and find this stuff. Now, well, let me just jump over this. These are specific methodologies, but then we start to do expert evaluation. Now, what I have to tell you is that this is very useful for companies that want to find something that appeals to them, but it's not exhaustive, because people in these subject matter groups tend to not say what the thing is about in a way that's clear to you and me coming in from the outside. So for example, if I'm in a kite surfing forum, I say something like, well, the something or other, the chicken loop twisted and so I did X. I'm not saying at all, this is about kite surfing. I assume anybody who's looking at that post knows it's about kite surfing. I also assume that anybody who knows anything knows what a chicken loop is. It's a kind of a particular piece of gear used in kite surfing. So you can't catch everything. It's really funny, but people who in Reddit, for example, talk about taking care of their children, they often don't mention that it's children they're talking about. They say, "Oh, I feed two at once by holding a bottle in the crook of my arm." To what? You know, everybody looking on that mother baby bump thing knows, but if I'm doing an artificial intelligence scan, I'm missing much of the data. But anyway, so all you have to find is some really good stuff from the perspective of a company. You don't have to find all the stuff. You just have to find some really good stuff. And so that's what we did, basically. We evaluated, and what we found was two kinds of categories. One was improvements. So everybody knows that there's a harness that you use in a kite surfing device. It spreads, you know, there's a rope between you and the kite, and if that rope just wrapped around your back, it would put huge pressure on one spot in your back. So you have the equivalent of sort of armor. You have a hard thing on your back, and the rope goes around that, and that's called a hard shell harness. And so those were improvements, you know, something for a kite seat for disabled people. But then we also found things that were totally sort of out of the box from the perspective of a searcher. So we found, for instance, drone surfing. That's when you throw away the kite entirely, and you're now using a drone instead of a kite, and you're surfing, and all of a sudden different things happen, like you don't have to worry anymore about the wind, and you can do all sorts of new tricks and stuff like that. So all of this stuff gets surfaced, and it's stuff which is what you would call a need solution pair. It's not necessarily all directed, as the other study was, along a dimension. Remember the other study, you were looking for improvements in surgical infection control? And so that's what you found. Here, what you're looking for is basically any improvement in the general category of kite surfing. And then you find all of these kinds of amazing things that you wouldn't have thought of before. You do get, as I showed you before, you do get improvements. You do get the kinds of things that you might find in the standard dimension search. You might say, how do I make this kite more efficient and so on. But you also find these off-the-wall things. So it's a potentially very exciting new methodology for you all to have in mind when you get sort of into your companies and the rest. This has taken off. I don't know whether any of you know about cosmetics. I don't know. They're now Ipsos, that company, is using it for their clients. And one of their clients is Lancome. Jane, do you know what Lancome is? I don't know what Lancome. They're a cosmetics company, right? And so they were trying to find out what people were doing with their cosmetics. And they found out they were doing totally different things than they thought, and innovating all over the place. So now, the arrangement I made with these people at Ipsos is that all of these methods are open source, so that people at MIT or anywhere can use them. You know, Ipsos can use them too, but this is not something that I'm doing for money with Ipsos. This is something that Ipsos is working on and will help everybody in general as well as themselves. So these papers will report on the methodologies you can use when you get there. Okay, so the next thing then is, once you identify these things, you want to know whether other people are picking it up. And so what we do is we do diffusion analysis. Namely, we say, well, what is the trend on people mentioning or talking about this thing, like drone surfing? Is drone surfing going to be something really cool? Namely, it's starting to take off, or is it sort of tending to die out? And so you see these different kinds of things here. Because Google controls the search index, they'll only tell you sort of relatively speaking, whether it goes up and down, and you really can't tell whether that 1200 there relative to 0 on the new hydrofoil concepts, you really can't tell whether that's 1.2 million or 12. You know, it's a relative scale, which is tough, but we'll have to figure out a way around that. Okay, so let me just summarize then. What we've done is we've said how you find innovations. How you find innovations, I'm going to go way back. This is more than you want to know, but of course I have to show you those arrows again. You wouldn't want to forget them, right? So again, what we're talking about here is, all right, now we understand how this works, how users innovate, and how important it is, and how they lead. What are mechanisms that we can use to start to manage and improve how we use the innovation process, because we now understand this? Okay, and once again, Erdine, you're next week, you're going to be talking about this activity of people who are engaged in trying to be entrepreneurs themselves based on user innovations, correct?
Excited about it. As it stands, a lot of successful companies have been founded by user innovators. And we'll ask the important question, is that a coincidence?
Mm-hmm.
And Eric and I happen to believe this is not a coincidence. And what we want to do is to, open the veil on the dynamics of how user innovators become user entrepreneurs, and what advantages are there for user innovators versus the competition. So that's next week, and then actually both sessions next week, and we'll have some fantastic guest speakers who are MIT alums as well, and successful user entrepreneurs.
Yeah, it's going to be fantastic. And Erdine has played the same seminal role that Mary Sonic played in the earlier days. He's really pushing this thing forward in a wonderful way, and so I'm proud to co-teach with him. So
thank you, Eric. I appreciate it. I feel the same way as you know.
Yeah, it's fun. All right, so we see you all next time, and thank you. And Jane, do you want to say anything about threatening them about how their things are on Friday?
No threats. I'm looking forward to reading your memos on Friday. And just to rehash from Monday, it'd be great if you guys just like pick one topic instead of trying to cover way too much, so you can go a little bit more deep in your memos. But that's it from me. I look forward to reading them.
All right. Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your week.
Yep.